One series that I never really saw myself getting into all that much was Monster Hunter. I owned Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on 3DS around the time it was released, but I never extensively played it too much. Found the controls to be clunky and stiff, and I didn't really find my footing until I picked up Charge Blade. But time progressed, and I ended up getting into Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate with a few friends, and they carried me through most of the game, but I never really got too invested into it. I didn't really get Monster Hunter until I picked up Monster Hunter World. Of course, World was a heavily streamlined game for a larger audience, but it really made me understand the game's essence. Fighting a large variety of monsters, the myriad of weapons, really started to speak to me in World. I started to fall in love with the grind and the hunting and forging new armors and weapons, and I actually used more than one weapon type. But stepping back and looking at more recent Monster Hunter games, I've noticed a weird peculiarity with it. Something I've experienced over the two games that I've sunk the most time into, Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise. You see, unlike most video games where the driving force behind the player's actions is involved in the plot, Monster Hunter story usually takes a back seat. Not so the plot is non-existent, but the game stories usually go something like...
Hunter, glad you're here. There's a monster that's threatening our way of life. Only you can defeat it before it destroys us all. Can you take care of it? Thanks, Hunter! But actually that monster wasn't the real problem. Turns out it's this other monster that's even more dangerous. Can you take care of it? Glad we got that out of the way. But actually it turns out there's another monster, and if it meets up with the one you just beat, there'll be trouble. But that's unlikely, so we can just...
This isn't to say that Monster Hunter plots are bad. I thought the story with the Caravaneer in 4 was interesting from what little I played. Plus, Monster Hunter games haven't had much of a need to rely on it before. For most players, the game's plot simply just to progress through the ranks or make new equipment and hunt monsters. They didn't need big overarching plots before, and I don't think they need them now. To explain my issues with Monster Hunter, I need to explain what I've seen as the two, let's call them phases of Monster Hunter: forging and hunting. When the player gets out of the game's tutorial, usually their first thought is to start a hunt, and this is where the game's hunting phase begins. This phase is where the majority of all the gameplay comes in, exploring the map to find a monster to capture or kill it, grabbing items along the way, and crafting things along the path. Anything that can be described as Monster Hunter gameplay is usually where this phase falls under. After a player defeats the monster and gains rewards for the hunt, they're sent back to the village, and the forging phase begins. This is the part of the game where players usually get to work on preparations for the next hunt. By heading to the smithy, they can craft new armors and weapons from monster parts they've acquired in previous hunts. Not only will this equipment vary in status numbers and appearance, but different armor sets will also have different skills that improve aspects about a character. Players can forge armor that has skills that benefit a type of weapon they're using, or they can get skills that benefit general actions like increasing attack damage or critical hit rate. In short, players hunt the monsters and forge equipment from their parts to hunt stronger monsters. And this system repeats itself for most of the game. And it works. A new player won't know what sort of armor or weapon that a monster will yield, so it's always exciting to rush back to the smithy to see what the new equipment looks like or what skills it'll yield. But first and foremost, there's always the hurdle of actually defeating the monster in combat. Most monsters vary in attack patterns, so when fighting a new monster for the first time, players have to learn how to fight them, and apply different strategies for different monsters. And this two-phase system works even better when failure is brought into the mix. I know I shouldn't be encouraging people to fail their hunts, but just hear me out for a second. If a player fails a hunt, they'll gain little reward for their efforts, but it can encourage them to take on a different quest in order to get better equipment to retry the quest they just failed. They could take on a different required hunt, or even engage in an optional quest that could make them fight a monster they wouldn't have fought otherwise. And as players progress further and further in the game, they'll increase their hunter rank and gain access to new hunts involving stronger monsters, and by extension, new armors and weapons. The game is split between three main rank categories: low rank, high rank, and master rank. What's more is that monsters are getting new moves in these higher ranks, and armor sets from different ranks will also vary in stats, skills, and sometimes even appearance. And over time, I believe the issue starts to reveal itself to me. There can only be so many monsters in one Monster Hunter title. Even when you complete the main story and any DLC expansions, you probably want to fight every monster in the game, so there's some incentive in that, but I start to ask the question, why bother? The monsters that were only accessible after beating the final boss were enough for me personally to work up the hunter rank to fight them, but after that I found my enthusiasm and motivated to be heavily drained, especially with the lack of a story beat to rely on. Previously I completed hunts and crafted new armor sets in order to use that armor for upcoming hunts that I might struggle with, or to progress the plot a bit. But with no more monsters left in the game to hunt, I begin to question why I should even bother completing armor sets I had previously set my sights on, as the only reason to do it at that point would be completion's sake. Not to mention the grind of fighting a tough monster for a 5% chance to get the item I need. I start to think to myself, what will I do after I make the armor? And I can never seem to find a solid answer, when the answer was so obvious earlier on in my playthrough. Usually when presented with a game design dilemma like this, I try and think of a solution myself. But for this, I struggle to find an answer. There can only be so many things to do in one Monster Hunter title, and that's no fault of Monster Hunter, it's simply the way things are with games concerned with file space and dedicating manpower to create more content. What I believe can be accredited to Monster Hunter's fault is the way they've been handling their post-release content. With Monster Hunter Rise's DLC, Sunbreak, Capcom revealed the Monster Hunter Sunbreak free update roadmap, which promises free content updates spanning until April of 2023 from its launch in June of 2022. More content for players for free is always a nice addition to a game. However, I have some qualms with how they've handled it. As it stands so far, these free content updates have released different monster variants for pre-existing monsters, essentially monsters with a different coat of paint that have slightly altered fighting styles or abilities, or elemental types compared to the regular counterparts. The crux of these updates have been monsters that we've already fought before with one new mechanic. Of course, they've also added some other things that add more to the grind and the foraging phase of the game, but I personally haven't seen it as enough to justify them. There has been one new monster added to Sunbreak via this free content roadmap, being Velkhana from Monster Hunter World Iceborne, and there's only one update left on the roadmap before major updates stop. I know I'm essentially complaining about free content, but hear me out from my perspective for a second. Say you're playing Monster Hunter Rise and you complete the main story of both the base game and the DLC. Not only that, but you've hunted every monster in the game at least once and gotten a pretty reliable set out of it. Pretty good weapons and armor with pretty good skills. Then you get told that there are new monsters to hunt, and you'll get some new ones over time. What's the point of hunting these monsters if you're practically already set for life? Especially since most of these new monsters are ones you've already fought prior to these updates. I had a similar situation occur in the previous entry with the series, Monster Hunter World. However, there's a major difference between Worlds and Rise's free content updates. Where Rise put on a lot of effort into its monster variants or subspecies or whatever the lore correct term is, World seemed to put a lot more, or at least some of its effort, into actual new monsters. Monsters like Rajang, Safi'jiiva, Latreon, Fatalis were all new introductions to World. And even then, World still introduced monster subspecies and variants, or etc, with Stygian Zinogre, Raging Brachydios, and even monsters they introduced in these new content updates like Furious Rajang. I did find myself actually playing World for a lot longer than I did Rise. Even though I was in the post-game of World, I still found ways to keep myself busy with the new monsters or the seasonal events that popped up from time to time. I ended up dropping World prior to the Fatalis update due to the wait in between updates taking too long and myself getting burnt out. The time for me to get burnt out was a lot shorter for Rise, since by the time I reached the end, the only thing I felt I had the need to do was grind out getting items for cosmetics. The new monsters didn't really spark my motivation to play it that much. Now, I will admit, this is a very niche issue. I know of a few people that still commit time to Monster Hunter Rise because the grind keeps them occupied, and that's all well and good. If other people can find enjoyment where I can't, then good on them. It just feels strange looking at the situation from my perspective. It feels as though the optimal way to play modern Monster Hunter would be to wait several months, or even a year after the game releases, so you can play the game with all the free content in. No wait necessary. At the time of recording this, I haven't really done much with Monster Hunter Rise. I've decided to wait for all the new content to be released in order to extend the amount of time I can play the game without feeling bored or getting burnt out. I'm hoping this issue can be addressed a little in a future title. I am aware that Monster Hunter Rise was a little rocky due to the Nintendo exclusivity deal, so I'm hoping these issues stem from that, especially since World handled things fairly well. So, in short, I think Capcom should have Galavinus and Gammoth back so I can fight the Fated Four, and I will change my mind about everything I've said. Thank you.